The dog lunged the moment Nora stepped through the gate. Not at her, past her. 200 pounds of gray muscle and ancient fury cleared the stone wall to her left, landed without a sound, and pressed its enormous head against the leg of the groom who had raised his voice at one of the stable boys a moment before. The groom went white. The stable boy ran. The dog stood there, not growling, not bearing anything, simply present, with the weight of something that is already decided and does not need to prove it. The groom stepped back 3 paces, then 4. The matter was settled in the way that very old and very plain power always settles things, which is without drama. Cormac turned, walked back through the gate, and sat down in the middle of the courtyard as if nothing had occurred. Nora Whitmore had been standing with her one bag in her hand the entire time, watching. She had arrived at Raven's Hollow House on a Wednesday morning in November, when the sky was the color of old pewter, and the ground smelled of wet earth and turned leaves and something else underneath those things, something mineral and deep, the smell of moorland that has had centuries to develop an opinion of itself. She was 24 years old and had come from Cork by train and then by cart, and the journey had taken most of Tuesday and all of Wednesday morning, and she was tired in the particular way that comes not from lack of sleep but from the long effort of holding yourself in the correct shape for public view. She had one bag because she did not have more than one bag's worth of things. She had a coat that was adequate for Cork winters, and was not yet sure about Northern England winters. She had a letter from a priest named Father Connolly, who had written warmly of her character and her steadiness under difficulty, and who had died the previous spring, which meant the letter could not be verified by anyone who had not known him personally, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Hadwick, had made her feelings on that matter clear, in the way that experienced housekeepers make things clear, which is without raising the voice and without leaving any room for negotiation. She had been hired anyway, because the estate was short-staffed and it was late in the season, and because, as the under-butler Mr. Graves had quietly observed to himself, she had honest eyes, which was not a credential he put into any official correspondence, but which he had learned over 31 years of managing households was as reliable an indicator as any letter of reference he had ever read. Nora did not know what honest eyes looked like. She had the eyes she was born with, and they had not served as a warning to the people in her life who should have been warned by them. The house was called Ravenshallow, which was a name that suited it. It sat on a wide stretch of moorland in the north of England with no other buildings visible in any direction when the weather was clear, which was not often. On the day Nora arrived it was not clear. The house materialized out of the November fog as the cart came up the drive, first as a suggestion and then as a fact. Gray stone and dark windows and a roofline that seemed to have been there long enough to consider itself a permanent feature of the landscape. It was not a welcoming house, but it was not an unwelcoming one either. It was simply a house that had its own arrangements and expected you to learn them. The man who owned it was called William Aldermere, the Duke of Aldermere by title, though he was the kind of man who wore his title the way other men wore a hat they had inherited and did not particularly choose. He was 41 years old, unmarried, and lived according to a set of habits so fixed and precise that the household ran according to them whether he was present or not. He rose at 6 every morning, and dressed without assistance, and took breakfast alone in the small dining room off the library, where he read the previous day's newspapers, which arrived one day late by virtue of the estate's remoteness. He spent the morning in his library, where he worked on a scholarly translation of medieval land records that he had been undertaking, in a careful and unhurried manner, for 11 years. He spent the afternoon walking the estate, in all weather, without exception. He returned at 4 and took tea alone. He dined at 7. He was in bed by 10. He spoke to his staff when it was necessary to speak to them. He was not rude. He was not warm. He was, the other maids told Nora on her first evening over a supper she ate in careful and attentive silence, simply particular. Particular about order. Particular about silence. Particular about the performance of work being neither announced nor apologized for but simply done. The only creature in the household that he treated with anything resembling open feeling was the dog. Cormac was an Irish wolfhound. That name described what he was without capturing what he was, the way the word house describes a building without capturing the thing you mean when you say the word home. He was gray and rough-coated, and stood nearly as high as a man's chest when he was on all 4 legs. His tail was long and could clear a side table with one casual motion. His paws were the size of dinner plates. His face was bearded and ancient, and his amber eyes contained the particular expression of something that has been observing the behavior of people for a very long time, and has developed complex views that it is too dignified to share. He had been at Ravenshallow for 6 years. In that 6 years he had accomplished the following: caused a footman named Gerald to lose the tip of his right index finger, this being the result of Gerald startling him in the upper corridor at night, which Gerald acknowledged he should not have done, and which Cormac did not appear to regret. He had caused a visiting distant relation of the Duke's to refuse to leave her guest room for 2 days after she opened her door and found him sitting outside it. He had driven off an undergardener who had lasted 14 days before informing Mr. Graves that he would not continue to work on the grounds of a house that contained an animal of that size and that demeanor, and the Duke had noted this departure without comment, and hired a new undergardener, who was made of sterner material, and who eventually developed a relationship with Cormac based on mutual indifference, which both of them seemed to find satisfactory. Every new member of staff was told within their first hour, do not approach the dog without permission. Do not make sudden movements near him. Do not make prolonged eye contact, because his sustained attention was not a comfortable experience. If he entered a room you were working in, leave the room quietly, close the door if possible, and inform Mr. Graves. Nora received these instructions from Clara Peel, the senior housemaid, who had been at Ravenshollow for 3 years, and who delivered the information with the seriousness of someone who has learned it through consequence rather than theory. Clara was thin, sharp-featured, efficient in all things. She wore her dark hair so tightly pinned that it seemed to pull her expression upward at the corners, giving her the permanent look of someone assessing whether a situation meets her standards. She liked things in their proper order, and Nora, arriving with an unverifiable letter and no clear history and being assigned the undermaid duties that were both the most numerous and the least prestigious in the household, was not in proper order, and Clara's management of her made this clear without saying it. Nora thanked her for the warning about the dog and asked which cupboard held the polishing cloths. She was not being rude, she was not indifferent, she was being practical, which was what she was when there was work to do and she had learned enough to begin doing it. She had always been practical. She had been practical since she was 9 years old and had understood that there was no one coming to manage things for her and that she would need to do it herself, and she had spent 15 years becoming very good at it. Her father, Owen Whitmore, was a man of considerable energy and no particular direction, who had worked at many things with enthusiasm, and none of them for very long. Her mother, Catherine, had died of a fever when Nora was 9, in the winter, and had been in Nora's memory ever since as a warmth that withdrew suddenly and permanently, the way the sun withdraws in late autumn without asking permission. After her mother there was a series of arrangements, none of them terrible and none of them enough, and the shape of Nora's life had been formed in the space between what was necessary and what was available, which was a narrow space and required precision to move through. She had cleaned houses before. She had worked in a laundry in Cork that started at 5 in the morning and paid what it paid, which was not much but was something, and something was what she had. She had learned to be quiet in rooms because quiet people attracted less notice, and she had learned to be thorough in her work because thorough work meant she was kept on, and she had learned to carry herself in a way that neither invited approach nor suggested need, because both of those things had costs she had stopped wanting to pay. What she had not accounted for, in the calculation she had made about Ravenshollow, was the dog. Cormac found her on her 3rd morning. She was in the scullery at 5:30, alone, in the dark before the rest of the household woke, working through the copper pots with the methodical attention she gave all work. The candle she had was small and left most of the room in shadow. She heard his claws on the stone floor before she saw him, that slow and deliberate sound, unhurried and enormous, and then he was in the doorway, and he filled it. He was very large in a doorway. In the courtyard he had been large in the way that things are large in open space, which is significant but manageable. In the doorway of the scullery he was something else. His head alone was at her shoulder height. His breath in the cold morning made a cloud in the air between them. His eyes caught the candlelight and held it and looked at her with a steadiness that did not feel like threat and did not feel like anything she had a ready word for. Nora put the cloth down in her hand. She looked at him. She did not reach toward him, and she did not step away. There were things she could have done in that moment that would have been understandable, and she did none of them. She simply looked at him the way you look at weather, without expectation and without particular feeling, waiting to see what it would do. What Cormac did was walk into the scullery. He moved with the unhurried gravity of something that is accustomed to having its decisions respected. He sniffed the air in her direction once, a brief and thorough investigation, the kind you make when you are confirming something you already suspect is true, and then he sat down 3 feet from where she was standing, and looked at the pot she had been cleaning. After a moment, Nora picked up the cloth and went back to work. She did not speak to him. She did not acknowledge him beyond being aware of him, which was easy because he was the largest thing in the room by a considerable margin. She cleaned the pot and moved to the next one and then the next one, and the candle burned down, and the gray of morning began to come through the single high window, and Cormac sat beside her and breathed and watched the work with the expression of a supervisor who is not yet ready to comment. When Clara arrived an hour later to begin the breakfast preparations, she stopped in the doorway with a sound that was not quite a scream but that occupied the same general region. She looked at the dog. The dog looked at Clara with the expression of someone who has assessed a sound and found it unimportant. "You should have left," Clara said, her voice pitched lower than usual. "The pots were half done," Nora said. She moved to the next pot. Clara's expression went through several arrangements before settling on something that prioritized efficiency over opinion. She went to find Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves arrived to find Cormac now lying beside the door, his head on his paws, in the manner of a feature of the room rather than a guest in it. The copper pots were clean and stacked. Nora was rinsing the bucket. Mr. Graves looked at the dog. He looked at Nora. He looked at the pots. "Has he done anything?" he said. "He has sat," said Nora, "and then lain down." Mr. Graves considered this for a moment with the expression of a man adding a piece of information to a picture he has not yet finished building. "Go about your work," he said. He went to tell the Duke. The Duke was at breakfast. He listened without interrupting, without changing his expression, without asking any of the several questions that Mr. Graves expected him to ask. When Mr. Graves finished, the Duke looked out the window toward the grey moorland and said, "Keep an eye on it." He returned to his newspaper. By the end of that first week, what Mr. Graves was keeping an eye on had become something the whole household was keeping an eye on, because it was not possible to pretend it was not happening. Cormac was where Nora was, not always directly beside her, not always visibly intentional, but present. If she was sent to the kitchen garden, he appeared at the garden gate. If she was in the upper corridor changing the linen in the guest rooms, he waited at the end of the corridor. Twice she had come out of her small room at the back of the house before dawn to find him lying across the threshold, and she had stepped over him and gone to work, and he had gotten up and followed. The other staff watched and said things to each other that they did not say to Nora, because Nora did not make herself available to that kind of conversation. She answered questions with what they required and no more. She was polite and precise and thorough, and she returned to whatever she had been doing when the conversation finished. Clara described her, to Dorothy, as contained. Dorothy said that was a word that could mean a great many things. Clara said it meant exactly what it meant. The Duke watched from windows. He did not comment. He did not ask questions. He watched the courtyard in the mornings when Nora crossed it with the coal, and he watched the kitchen garden on Thursday afternoons when she worked there, and he watched with the expression of someone observing a fact that requires more data before it can be understood. On the morning of her 19th day at Ravenshollow, Nora found a clean bowl of water outside the scullery door, recently filled, placed where she would see it. It had not been there the day before. No one mentioned it. When she looked across the courtyard toward the house, the library window held nothing but the gray November sky. She went to work. Cormac drank from the bowl and followed her. The first snow came on a Monday, thin and indecisive, and the house drew itself together around it the way old houses do, pulling everyone toward warmth and enclosure. Nora had been at Ravenshollow for 7 weeks. She had learned the house the way she learned every house she worked in, which was completely and systematically, beginning with the practical knowledge and moving inward to the social. She knew which floorboards announced themselves in the upper corridor, and at what time of night the announcement would cause the most disruption. She knew which chimney in the east wing drew badly and needed to be coaxed with paper before the coal caught. She knew that the kitchen cat, who was called Gray's for reasons no one fully remembered, would eat anything left unattended on the low shelf but respected the high shelf as belonging to a different order of things. She knew that the youngest footman, a boy named Harry Allison who was 17 and homesick, cried quietly in the boot room on Sunday evenings, and emerged from it dry-eyed and resolute, as if the crying were a practical task like any other. She knew all of this because she moved through the house quietly and paid attention, and the people around her forgot she was there, and then did and said things they did not perform for an audience. This was the quality of invisibility that she had cultivated, and that served her well, and that was, though she had never framed it this way, also a kind of loneliness, which she had never found useful to notice. What she had not expected to learn was the dog's geography. She had assumed Cormac lived in some fixed arrangement, with the Duke or near the stables or in a dedicated room she had not yet seen. She discovered over those first weeks that this was not accurate. Cormac lived in the house the way the house itself lived, which was according to its own logic rather than anyone else's. He was in the kitchen on cold nights, near the range, where he was tolerated by Mr. Hobbs, who communicated his tolerance by always leaving a particular extent of floor space near his own feet visibly unoccupied. He was in whichever room had held the last fire of the evening when the house quieted. He was, Twice, in the corridor outside Nora's room, sleeping across the width of it in a way that required her to step over him, which she did, and he acknowledged not at all. The other staff said this was new behavior. He had never stationed himself outside anyone's room before. They said it with the careful tone of people who are building a case without yet knowing the verdict. What Nora observed, which they did not observe because they were not positioned to observe it, was this. The dog was not following her because she had earned it. She had done nothing to earn it. She had not fed him extra food or spoken to him softly or sat with him in the evenings or done any of the things that people do to acquire the loyalty of animals. She had simply, on that first morning, not run. And she had a theory about what that meant to him, which she kept to herself because theories about the interior lives of wolfhounds were not the kind of things she brought into general conversation. Her theory was that most people, when they encountered Cormac, flinched, not always visibly. But the body knows what the mind is thinking, and the body, when faced with something that large and that powerful, and that unhurried in its own confidence, arranged itself in the shape of a person who was ready to yield ground. And Cormac had been looking, perhaps, for someone who would simply stand there, not challenge him, not perform fearlessness, simply stand in the position of a person who had already decided that this situation, like most situations, was something to be worked with rather than fled from. She had been working with situations since she was 9. She had run out of the energy for flight a long time before she arrived at Ravenshallow. The evenings were when she thought. The room assigned to her was small and at the back of the house with a single window that looked over the kitchen garden and a chair of aging dignity and a hook on the door for the dress she was not wearing. She had not decorated the room because she had brought nothing decorative, and because she had not, in a long time, expected to be somewhere long enough to justify it. The wall was plain and the floor was bare, and the window at night reflected the candle back at her, and she sat in the chair with whatever thinking required doing, and did it. She had the rosary that Father Connolly had given her when she was 18, which was the year he arrived in their parish, and was the first adult who asked her questions without wanting anything in return. It was a plain rosary, wooden beads worn smooth at the places where they had been most held, and she kept it in her pocket during the day and on the windowsill at night. She did not always pray. Sometimes she held it because it was the only thing she owned that someone had given her without calculation. She had also, and this she had not told anyone at Ravenshallow, the ability to read Latin. Father Connolly had taught her. He had taught her over 2 years, in the evenings after her other work, at the table in the parish house. He had called it a practical skill. She had argued that dead languages were by definition not practical, and he had said, with the mild certainty he brought to all his convictions, that the world was full of doors and Latin was the key to a surprising number of them. She had believed him because she had no reason not to, and because there was something in learning a language that no one expected her to know that felt like its own small act of reclamation, and she had worked at it carefully and consistently until she could read it well and parse a text with patience. She had not used it at any point in her working life before Ravenshallow because no one had needed it. Laundry required no Latin, copper pots required no Latin, sheet counting required no Latin. She had kept it in the interior place where she kept things she had paid for in time and attention and was not ready to give up. It was the cook who told the Duke, without intending to. Mr. Hobbs, who communicated through the medium of food and otherwise spoke mainly about food, mentioned in the context of an entirely different conversation that the new undermaid seemed educated above her station, that he had seen her reading in the evenings on more than one occasion, that he had once watched her read the label on an old bottle of wine from the cellar and sound out a phrase that he had thought was French but that she said was Latin, without hesitation and without looking it up. He had thought it interesting. He was not sure if it was relevant. The Duke filed it. He was a man who filed things and examined them later at a different angle. 2 days after that conversation, Mr. Graves appeared in the corridor where Nora was working and told her, without explanation, that the East Wing Library Annex needed cleaning and organizing, and that she should begin the following morning and report to no one about it except Mr. Graves himself. She said she would. The annex was a long, narrow room between the main library and the east stairwell. It had not been used as an active working space for several years, which was visible in the quality of the dust on the shelves, which had achieved the depth and solidity of something that was considering becoming structural. The central table held 3 stacks of papers that had been placed there at different times by someone who had meant to return to them and had not. The shelves held books in no order that Nora could immediately identify, though she suspected there was an order and that it had simply accumulated exceptions until the exceptions had outnumbered the rule. She began at one end with a cloth and a bucket and worked methodically toward the other, which was how she did everything. On her 3rd morning in the annex, the Duke appeared in the doorway. He was carrying a cup of tea in his own hand, which she noted because she had not yet seen him carry anything himself, tasks of that nature being handled by the footman. He looked at the progress of the cleaning for a moment without comment. Then he looked at the papers on the table and said, without particular inflection, that those were his grandfather's estate records and that they had been waiting to be sorted for some time. Nora said she understood. She asked if she should dust around them or move them. The Duke said they would need sorting eventually. Nora said she could sort them if he told her the system he wanted. She said this because it was the practical thing to say, and because papers in disorder were a solvable problem, and she liked solvable problems. He looked at her for a long moment. It was not the kind of long look she had learned to be wary of. It was the other kind, which assessed rather than appraised, and she held it without adjusting her expression. He told her the system, by year, then by type, within 3 categories he named once clearly. He did not repeat himself. He left. She sorted the first stack in an afternoon. The papers were old but legible, and the categories were logical, and several documents were in Latin, which she read and noted and sorted without difficulty. When she placed the finished stack on the cleared end of the table with her penciled notations on top, she told no one. She went back to her other duties and returned the following morning. The stack had been examined. She could tell from the position of her notations, which had been picked up and replaced at a slightly different angle. The notations had been read carefully enough to crease the edge of the top page. There was a second cup on the table, empty and clean, placed at the opposite end from her working position. She sat down and began the second stack. She did not mention the cup to anyone. Cormac came in at mid-morning and settled on the floor between the table and the door, and in that way the 3 of them shared the room across several days, and the work was done. Clara had not stopped watching. Clara had simply changed what she was watching for. She brought her observations to Dorothy Fenn, who had been the senior housemaid at Ravenshollow for 12 years, and who had therefore seen enough of the particular patterns of this house and this man to have formed views she trusted. Dorothy listened to Clara with the patient attention she gave to most things and then asked, in order, had Nora done anything improper? Had the Duke done anything improper? Had either of them said or indicated anything that should be reported to Mr. Graves? Clara said no to all 3. Dorothy said, then what you are watching is something that does not yet have a name. Things without names are not yet problems. Clara went away not entirely satisfied. Dorothy returned to her work. The snow on the moor deepened and the house settled into the shape of winter, and in the annex, the records of 40 years of an estate were put in order, 1 stack at a time, and Cormac slept on the floor between the table and the door. What no one in the house understood yet, and what Nora was only beginning to understand herself, was that the annex had become the one room at Ravenshollow where she did not assess the exits when she arrived, where she did not manage the temperature of the room before she allowed herself to settle into work, where she worked with her full attention on the work itself, and not on the portion of attention she always reserved for the management of whatever the room might require from her. She had not known that she did that in every other room. She had not known because she had been doing it for so long that it had become invisible to her, the way breathing is invisible. It was only the absence of it, in the annex, with the papers and the quiet and the dog on the floor, that made her notice it had been there. She sat with that noticing for a long time one evening, in her chair at the window with the rosary in her hand, and she was not sure what to do with it, which was unusual. She was generally sure what to do with things. She set it aside, because she did not yet have the context to understand it, and she went to bed, and Cormac was in the corridor outside her door, and she stepped over him carefully, and he did not open his eyes, and she lay in her bed and listened to the moor wind outside and thought, some things are very simple, and I have made them complicated. And she did not yet know what she meant by that exactly, but she thought she might in time. Lord Ellery arrived on a Thursday, 2 weeks before Christmas, and the house changed its quality of attention the moment his carriage came through the front gate. Not through alarm, through a particular form of readiness that households develop around certain categories of visitor, the readiness of people who know that the ordinary rules of an ordinary day are about to be suspended, and who are adjusting their internal calibrations accordingly. Mr. Graves had spoken to the senior staff the previous evening. His address had been brief and direct. Lord Ellery was the Duke's brother. He was a guest of the house. He was to be afforded every courtesy and every assistance. Any request outside the ordinary scope of duty was to be brought to Mr. Graves immediately. Any difficulty of any kind was to be brought to Mr. Graves immediately. He had looked at each of them as he said this, which was a form of emphasis that required no additional words. Nora heard this address and filed it alongside the other things she had filed about Ravenshollow. She had worked in enough houses to know what it meant when a housekeeper or a butler felt the need to hold a preventive address before a guest arrived. It meant the guest had a pattern, and the household had learned the pattern. and the address was the household arranging its collective body in the correct shape for what was coming. Lord Ellery was 34 years old, younger than his brother by 7 years, and different from him in the way that people who have grown up in the same house can be different, which is to say profoundly, and in exactly the ways that the shared house might have predicted. Where the Duke was quiet, Lord Ellery was loud in the easy, unself-conscious way of people who have always occupied rooms without wondering whether the room wanted them. He was warm in the immediate and slightly effortful way of people who have learned that warmth is the most efficient key to most doors. He laughed well, and at the right moments, he remembered names from one meeting to the next and used them, which made people feel seen in the way that people feel seen when they suspect the feeling is at least partly manufactured, but find they cannot help responding to it. He came with 2 trunks and a personal valet named Reeves, who was compact and silent and who moved through the house like a parenthesis. By the second evening of his visit, Lord Ellery had made the youngest footman, Harry Allison, feel that his opinion on the port was genuinely sought and sincerely valued. He had told Mr. Hobbs that the pheasant was the finest he had eaten in recent memory, which was the kind of specific compliment that goes into a cook's interior and stays there. He had charmed Clara into something approaching a smile, which Clara herself seemed surprised by. He had, in other words, done what he always did when he arrived in a new space, which was to make the space quickly and thoroughly comfortable with his presence in it. None of this required effort exactly. It was simply the application of a skill practiced so long it had become reflex. Nora watched all of it from the appropriate distances of her position and work. She watched in the way she watched everything in a new environment, which was carefully and without showing the carefulness. She watched the shape of his attention and how it moved through the room, and which things it snagged on and which it passed over, and by the end of his first full day she had a reasonable model of him, which she stored alongside the other models she had built over the years. He noticed her on the Friday morning. She was carrying a load of fresh linen through the upper corridor toward the guest wing, and he was coming up from breakfast and they met at the top of the stairs. She had heard him on the stairs before she saw him, and had already arranged herself in the position that experience had taught her was correct for this situation, which was pressed to the near side of the corridor, looking at the level of his cravat, waiting for him to pass. He did not pass. He stopped. He said, "You are new." "Yes, sir. 7 weeks, sir." "And your name?" "Nora Whitmore, sir." He said her surname the way people say a name they are tasting rather than recognizing. "Irish," he said. Not a question. An observation that was angling toward something. "Yes, sir." He smiled. The smile was the same one she had seen him deploy in the servants' hall and at the dinner table, which was its own information. "You must find it very quiet here. My brother is not known for his sociability." "I find it suits me well, sir." She shifted the linen fractionally in her arms, which was a small message about the weight of the thing she was carrying. He received the message and chose not to act on it. "My brother tells me you have been helping in the old annex, sorting through the family papers." He said this with a quality of mild interest that was careful enough to be interesting. He had gotten the information from his brother, which meant his brother had mentioned her, which was a fact she filed without allowing it to change anything about her expression. "I have been, sir, yes." "That sounds like dull work," he said. "All those old documents." "I find it interesting, sir." He tilted his head. Something in his attention shifted quality, became slightly more focused, and she felt it the way you feel a change in temperature before you understand the reason for it. "Interesting," he said. "You are not what I expected of an undermaid." "I will take that as a compliment, sir," she said pleasantly, and moved past him with the linen, and continued down the corridor without looking back. She felt his attention follow her to the end of the corridor. She went downstairs and found Clara in the linen room and told her, with no particular emphasis, that Lord Ellery had stopped her in the upper corridor, and asked her name and mentioned the annex work. She said she thought Mr. Graves should know, given what he had said the previous evening. Clara looked at her for a moment with an expression that was reassessing something. Then she said she would tell Mr. Graves. She went and found him before the next quarter hour was up. Mr. Graves had been a butler long enough to recognize the pattern as soon as Clara delivered the first 3 facts. He went quietly to find Dorothy Fenn. Dorothy went quietly to speak with the Duke, in the brief and professional manner of someone conveying information that has been prepared carefully, so that its implications are clear without needing to be stated. The Duke said nothing immediately. He was in his library. He looked at the fire for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you, Dorothy." And Dorothy went back to her duties. That same afternoon, Lord Ellery, who had developed the habit of taking his after-luncheon walk through the upper corridors of the house, rather than the grounds, came up the east staircase and found Cormac sitting at the top of the stairs. The dog was not doing anything. He was sitting. He was facing the corridor in the direction of the guest rooms and the direction from which Lord Ellery had been accustomed to walking. He occupied the top of the stairs with the settled, absolute quality of something that has been there for a long time and expects to remain. Lord Ellery stopped. He assessed the situation. He tried the left side of the corridor, and Cormac's head moved to track him. He tried the right side, and Cormac's head moved in the same unhurried, attentive way. He was not growling. He was not displaying anything. He was simply very large and very present, and looking at Lord Ellery with the full amber weight of his attention. Lord Ellery stood at the top of the stairs for a full 90 seconds. Then he made a sound of mild irritation, and went back down and found another route. Nora, coming out of the linen room at the end of the corridor a few minutes later, found Cormac sitting at the top of the stairs looking in the direction Lord Ellery had gone. She stood beside him for a moment and did not ask him anything, because she had long since established that he was not going to answer. She scratched briefly behind his ear, which was the first time she had touched him voluntarily in 7 weeks, and then she picked up her basket and went about her work, and he fell into step beside her. That evening at dinner, Lord Ellery told his brother that the dog needed more discipline. The Duke said, "He is very well disciplined." Lord Ellery said that blocking a man's path in his own house was not what he considered disciplined behavior. The Duke said, "He was not blocking your path. He was sitting at the top of a staircase. There are other stairways in the house." Lord Ellery looked at his brother for a moment. "You're defending a dog." "I am clarifying a factual point," the Duke said, and returned to his dinner. The subject was not reopened that evening. It was 2 days later that Ellery came to the annex. He came openly, in the middle of the afternoon, and he said he had come to see what was there, the old family papers, which he had heard about and never looked at. He stood in the doorway and looked at the shelves Nora had already organized and at the stacks she was working through, and he asked her several questions about what she had found, questions that were genuine questions about the papers, about dates and documents and an estate dispute from the 1790s that had apparently gone unresolved for longer than anyone had noticed. She answered them because they were genuine questions and because she knew the answers, and because the annex was a room where she was accustomed to answering questions about the work directly. Cormac was on the floor. He had been there since morning. Ellery asked his questions and she answered them, and then the questions shifted. Not suddenly, not obviously. They shifted in the way that certain kinds of attention shift, by degrees, each small step natural enough on its own, the aggregate of steps arriving somewhere the individual steps did not predict. He said she was remarkable for her position. He said she must have had some unusual advantages in her education. He said he wondered how she had come to be working in such a place. They were not improper questions. They were questions with a particular quality of pressure behind them, gentle and apparently idle, and she knew that quality, and had known it for a long time, and she was thinking about how to answer when she noticed something. She noticed that he had moved. He was still in the doorway, but he was occupying more of the doorway than he had been occupying when he arrived. He had not moved in one motion. He had settled into a position across several minutes, the way things settle, incrementally, in ways that are only clear when you measure the beginning and the end. She had not run the calculation consciously. Her body had run it first, and she felt the result of it before she had the words for it, which was a familiar sequence. She looked up from the papers she had been appearing to sort. She looked at Cormac. Cormac was already standing. He had not made a sound. He was standing between the table and the door in the position of something that has placed itself where it means to be, and he was looking at Lord Ellery with the full amber weight of his attention, and he was perfectly still in the way that very powerful things are still when they have decided on a position. Lord Ellery looked at the dog. He looked at Nora. He looked at the dog again. "I see," he said, after a silence that was slightly longer than comfortable. He said, "Good afternoon." He left. His footsteps went down the corridor at a pace that was slightly accelerated compared to his usual one. Nora sat very still after the footsteps faded. She had her hands flat on the table. She was looking at the document in front of her, an estate record from 1847 concerning the management of the Northfields, and she was not reading it. She was breathing. She was counting the breaths in the way she had learned to count them, which was a skill in the same category as the Latin, something practical that Father Connolly had not taught her but that life had. She had been in rooms like that before. She had been in rooms where the calibration shifted and there was no door available and no one who would have come if she had made a sound. She had been in those rooms and she had managed them with the toolkit she had assembled for that purpose, and she had never told anyone about the toolkit, because telling people required trust, and trust required evidence, and evidence took time. She took a breath. She put both palms flat on the old solid wood of the table, and felt the weight and the permanence of it, and breathed again. Cormac put his head on her arm. Just his head, his chin resting on her forearm, his enormous weight settling gently, his amber eyes looking sideways up at her with the patient, uncomplicated attention of something that requires nothing in return for being there. She sat with that for a long time. Her hand found the side of his face, the rough, warm fur, the solid reality of him, and she held it there. And the winter light came through the annex window in a long pale stripe and lay across the floor between them, and the house was quiet. She had not cried. She did not cry. But she stayed there with her hand on the side of his face for longer than the situation technically required, and when she finally went back to the papers, her breathing was steady, and her hands were steady, and she was fine in the thorough and functional way that she had always made herself fine. Except that this time, there had been something else there with her while she did it, something warm and heavy and without agenda, and that was different from every other time. That evening, without apparent connection to any specific event, the Duke told Mr. Graves that Lord Ellery's visit had reached its natural conclusion somewhat earlier than anticipated, and that arrangements for his departure should be made for the weekend. He said it in the tone he used for practical decisions that had been made and did not require discussion. Mr. Graves said of course, and went to arrange it. Lord Ellery left on Saturday morning with his 2 trunks and the silent Reeves. He shook his brother's hand in the front hall with the expression of a man who has drawn conclusions he intends to examine later, at a distance, when they are less recent. He did not look toward the east wing. He got into the carriage and the gate closed behind him, and the house returned to itself with the unhurried ease of a thing resuming its correct shape. That afternoon the Duke came by the kitchen garden on his walk. Nora was there collecting the last of the winter rosemary, which was stubborn and kept growing past the frost if you let it. The Duke stopped at the gate. She did not look up immediately. When she did, he was looking at her with the assessing and quiet look that she had come to understand was his form of paying careful attention. He said, "Mr. Graves told me you reported the corridor incident on the Friday morning." "I thought it should be known, sir," she said. "You were right," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Thank you, sir." He nodded once, precisely, and continued his walk. Cormac, who had been sitting beside her in the kitchen garden throughout, watched him go around the corner, and then looked back at Nora. She looked at the dog. She looked at the corner where the Duke had gone. She went back to the rosemary. The thaw came in late February, slow and gradual, and the moors took on the color of rust where the bracken was releasing the winter, and the kitchen garden showed the first green tips of the bulbs that Nora had planted in October, with no particular plan but with the quiet assumption that she would be there to see them. She noticed the assumption later. She had not made it consciously. It was simply there, embedded in the action of pressing the bulbs into the cold ground, with the intention of their return. 4 months at Ravens Hollow. The house had changed around her, or she had changed within it, or both things had occurred simultaneously, which was probably the more accurate description. Houses do not change easily. People are more accommodating. What had changed in the house was small and visible, primarily to those who had been watching. Clara no longer gave Nora's presence the assessment of someone monitoring a situation of uncertain outcome. She was not warm, exactly, but she passed information directly now instead of through Dorothy, and she poured the first tea of the morning for both of them, which she had begun doing in late January with no announcement, and no acknowledgement that it was new. Dorothy had said to Nora, on a morning in early February, in the passing and offhand manner of someone delivering something they had been thinking about for weeks, "You came into this house walking like someone expecting to be asked to leave." She paused. She did not look at Nora directly. "You do not walk that way anymore." She moved on before Nora could respond. Nora turned the observation over for several days afterward, not because it surprised her, but because she was trying to understand the mechanism of what had changed. She was not a person who changed without knowing what had changed her. She was a person of deliberate choices, built carefully over years of situations that had demonstrated the cost of impulsive ones. But she had not chosen this. Something had shifted in her without being a decision, below the level of decision, in the place where the body lives before the mind catches up. And the thing that had shifted first, before anything else, before the annex and the Duke and the slow transformation of the household's quality of attention, was the dog. Cormac had walked into the scullery before dawn, and sat beside her, and not asked for anything. That was all. That was the whole of it. He had sat beside her and required nothing, and she had been, without knowing it, in a state of such sustained and practiced management of what rooms required from her, that the simple experience of something requiring nothing had been, in some deep and almost inconvenient way, transformative. She did not examine this too closely. She was not given to excessive examination of the interior. She was given to doing the work and using the evidence and making the choices that the evidence supported. The evidence supported this. She had not been afraid in this house for some time now. She had not been performing the invisible labor of alertness that she had performed in every other room of every other house since she was 9 years old, and the first thing that had produced that result was an Irish wolfhound sitting down beside her and breathing and staying. She scratched behind his ear when she thought about this, which he accepted without ego. The Duke came to the annex in the second week of March with a particular quality of purposefulness that she had learned to distinguish from his ordinary purposefulness, which was already notable. He carried his own tea. He sat down at the opposite end of the table from her working position, which he had begun to do over the previous weeks with increasing naturalness, as if the habit of sitting there had been developing underground and had simply surfaced. He looked at the finished shelves for a moment. The East Wing Annex had been, when she arrived, a room of accumulated disorder. It was now a room of organized and accessible records covering 60 years of a significant estate, catalogued in a system that was both logical and retrievable, with notations in her small and consistent handwriting, and with the Latin documents properly marked and cross-referenced. He said, "This is better than I had hoped." She said, "The original records were kept carefully. They only needed finding." He said, "Most things that need finding do not get found, because finding them requires someone to believe they are worth the effort." She looked at him. He was looking at the shelves, not at her, and his expression had the quality of something said in passing that contains more than the passing requires. She said, "Father Connolly used to say that the most useful things in the world were the ones nobody had bothered to look at yet." The Duke was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He sounds like a man of genuine convictions." He was, she said. He was also right about the Latin. The Duke looked at her then, with the full version of the assessing and quiet look. "So I discovered," he said. He said it with a dryness that had warmth behind it, which she had come to recognize as his version of being amused. They worked for the remainder of the morning. He worked on his own correspondence and she worked on the final boxes of the old records, and Cormac slept between them on the floor, and the March light came in through the annex window and grew longer as the morning progressed. They did not talk much. They did not need to talk much. The silence between them had long since become the productive kind rather than the careful kind, which is a significant distinction. What happened next happened on a Wednesday morning in late March, and it happened in the ordinary way that significant things sometimes happen, without ceremony or warning, in the middle of things. The Duke looked up from his correspondence, he said, with the particular quality of careful arrangement that she had come to associate with things that mattered to him. "I have been thinking about the arrangement here." She looked up from the box she was sorting. He said the work she was doing was well beyond the scope and compensation of her current position. He said he had been aware of this for some time and had not addressed it promptly, which he acknowledged was poor practice. He said there was a role in the household that had not been filled since his father's time, that of archivist and correspondence assistant, with a separate wage and proper hours and duties that accurately reflected the work she was actually doing. He said if she was agreeable, he would like to offer her that position. Nora set down the document in her hand. She looked at the table. She thought about the cost. She had been in houses where things were offered and costs arrived afterward in a different shape, and she had spent a long time learning to anticipate costs and decline the offer to avoid them. She had built that anticipation into the structure of her daily navigation, the way a builder puts foundations under a house, not visible from the outside but holding everything up. She had spent 4 months looking for the cost in this house. She had looked with the same thoroughness she brought to organizing 60 years of estate records. She had not found it. She said, "I would like to think about it." He said, "Of course." He left. She sat at the table and thought, and Cormac put his head in her lap, the way he did when she was sitting and still. The simple and habitual placement of his enormous weight against her, requiring nothing, and she rested her hand on the side of his face and felt the warm reality of him and thought. What she was thinking about was not whether she wanted the role. She wanted it. She was thinking about trust, about what it meant to trust something you could not fully verify, about the difference between evidence and certainty, and the place in between where most of life actually required you to stand. Father Connolly had stood in that place without apparent discomfort. She had once asked him how he managed it, and he had said, "You look at the pattern of the behavior across time, and you ask yourself if the pattern has a direction, and if the direction is consistently towards something rather than away from it, you trust the direction." She looked at Cormac. He was looking back at her with the amber steadiness that had been the first thing at Raven's Hollow she had trusted before she had decided to trust it. The pattern, she thought, had a direction. The direction was consistently toward. She went the next morning to find Mr. Graves and asked if she could speak to the Duke. She told him yes. Cormac was 10 years old when he died. He died on a Tuesday morning in October, on the floor of the corridor between the library and the working room, in the place he had chosen as his own some years before and never abandoned. The veterinary man, who came from the nearby town at Mr. Graves's urgent message and arrived within 2 hours, said there had been no pain. He said the heart had simply finished its work with the abruptness of things that work very hard for a very long time and then stop. He said it as gently as a man can say such a thing, standing in a corridor with his hat in his hands. Nora was in the working room when it happened. She had come out when she heard Graves in the corridor, and she stood in the doorway for a moment, and then she walked out and sat down on the floor beside him, which was not the dignified or professional thing to do, and which she did anyway, because dignity and profession were not the point, and she had long since stopped managing her responses in this house to meet an audience's expectations. He was very still. He was always still, in the particular way of large things that know their own weight, but this was a different kind of stillness, the final and complete kind, and she sat beside it for a long time with her hand on his side, before the veterinary man gently said what he had to say, and she stood up and went inside. The Duke had been in the library. He came out when Mr. Graves went to him. He stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at the space that Cormac had occupied so completely and for so long, and Nora watched him from the doorway of the working room and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that the moment did not already contain. He had written, in the private memoir that no one would read until long after both of them were gone from Ravenshallow, about the dog in the way that a man writes about something when he is not performing for anyone but himself. He had written that Cormac had possessed a quality he had never encountered in another creature, human or otherwise, which was the quality of perfect attention without demand. That the dog had seen, in the first weeks after Nora's arrival, something that the Duke himself had been too careful and too habituated to his own distance to see until much later, and had simply gone and sat beside it, and kept sitting, because that was the correct response and he knew it and acted on it without deliberation. He had written, "The dog did what I had been meaning to do and lacked the simplicity to do. He went where he was needed and he stayed. He asked nothing. He trusted the rightness of being there over the comfort of staying in a known place. I trust his judgment in this, as I trusted it in all things." The grave was in the kitchen garden, under the rowan tree at the northeast corner, the oldest tree on the property, the one that had been there before the house was built and that flowered in spring and buried in autumn with the unhurried reliability of something that has been doing the same thing for a very long time and has no intention of stopping. Nora chose the location. She chose it because she had been tending the kitchen garden for 4 years by then, and she knew every corner of it, and knew that the northeast corner, under the rowan, was the place where the light came first in the morning and stayed longest in the evening, and she thought that was right. She chose the words for the marker herself. She thought for 2 full days before she decided on them. She was not thinking for 2 days because the words were hard to find. She was thinking for 2 days because she wanted them to be exactly right, which is the requirement she placed on everything she did, and the requirement was higher for this because this was not work. This was the thing she owed him, and she owed it precisely. She had tried several versions in her head. She had tried things that described what he was, his size, his nature, his particular quality of being. She had tried things that thanked him, but gratitude in stone felt wrong, too much like a transaction, and what he had given her had never been a transaction. She had tried things that described what he had done, but what he had done was also not quite the point. What he had done was see something. That was the point. Before anyone else in that house or in her life had looked at her and seen the actual shape of what was there, this animal had walked into a scullery before dawn and sat down beside her, and in the simplest possible way communicated, "I see you. I am not leaving." 3 words. He knew. The stonemason came from the village, and cut them carefully into the gray stone, and Nora stood beside the Duke on the morning it was placed, and neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that the 3 words did not already say. The rowan tree was bare in November, its berries long since taken by the birds, its branches black against the pale sky, and the kitchen garden was put to bed for winter in the way that she put it to bed every autumn, with care, and with the intention of its return. She had planted bulbs again that morning. Before the stonemason arrived, she had knelt in the cold earth at the base of the rowan tree and pressed them in carefully, because they needed to be below the frost line, and because they would come up in spring in that place, and that seemed like the right kind of continuation. The Duke watched her plant them. He had come out with his tea and watched from a few feet away, and when she finished and stood and brushed the soil from her hands, he said, "You planted bulbs beside him." She said, "They will come up in spring." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Yes." That was all. He went back inside. She gathered her tools and followed. In the years after, The life they had built at Raven's Hollow continued in the way that well-made things continue, without requiring supervision or apology. The archive was kept current and well-organized. The correspondence was handled with precision. The kitchen garden produced every year what it had been asked to produce, and the bulbs under the rowan came up each spring, yellow and white and determined, in the way that planted things come up when the ground is tended and the attention is consistent. There were other dogs, eventually. The Duke brought a young wolfhound to Raven's Hollow when Cormac had been gone for a year. She was called Brigid, for no particular reason that he explained, and she was not Cormac, and was not meant to be, and she was good company in her own way, and in time she learned the corridors and the corners of the house with the same patient authority that Cormac had learned them, and she slept in the corridor between the library and the working room because it was warm there, and because it seemed to be the correct place for a dog to sleep in this house, which she appeared to understand without being told. The household changed around all of this as households change, through the ordinary movement of people in and out. Clara eventually left to be married to a man from the village, and at her leaving there was a warmth between her and Nora that had not been present on the morning of the copper pots, and that had developed without either of them deciding to develop it, through the slow accumulation of shared work and shared winters and shared tea at first light. Dorothy retired after 30 years at Raven's Hollow and moved to a cottage in the valley and sent letters on the great occasions. Mr. Graves continued, immovable, precise, and took his tea with the new footmen and taught them what he knew. On the 3rd anniversary of Cormac's death, Nora went to the kitchen garden in the early morning, before the household woke, and stood at the rowan tree for a while with her hands in her coat pockets. The stone was mossed at the corners now, which happened with time and with weather, and the letters were still clear. He knew. She stood there in the cold and did not pray, and did not speak, and simply occupied the space for a while, which was what he had done for her in every room she had worked in, and which seemed like the right return. She thought about the morning in the scullery, 6 years before. The dark and the candle and the cold and the sound of his claws on the stone floor and then his presence in the doorway, enormous and unhurried, and entirely without agenda. She thought about putting the cloth down and waiting, and the quality of the waiting, which had been different from her usual waiting, which was a managed and calculated thing. She had waited with nothing in her hands and nothing to manage, and he had come into the room and sat down and she had gone back to work, and that had been the beginning of it. She thought about what the beginning of it had given her, over the years since that morning, and she did not have precise words for all of it. She had words for some of it, a room she did not have to manage, work that suited her, a house that expected her continued presence as a fact rather than a favor, the particular quality of a life that had stopped being temporary. And the rosary on the windowsill, which she still kept there, which she still held sometimes in the evenings when the day had been long, and which felt different than it had felt in Cork, and different than it had felt in the first months at Raven's Hollow. It felt like what it was, which was something she had been given freely, by someone who had seen her clearly, and who had believed that what he saw was worth the time. She had been seen clearly in this house. First by a dog, and then by the people who had learned to look more carefully because the dog had set the example. She thought that was an unusual legacy for an animal to leave, and that it was also entirely fitting, because he had always been the clearest-sighted creature in any room he occupied. The spring bulbs were still weeks away. The garden was bare and brown and the rowan was leafless, and the sky above it was the color of old pewter, very like the sky on the morning she had arrived. She stood in it for a while longer. Then she went inside, because there was work to be done and the kettle needed putting on, and she was, as she had always been, a practical person. He knew. 3 words on a stone in a kitchen garden in the north of England, under a rowan tree that had been there before the house, that would be there after. 3 words that meant, in a world that required most people to make themselves small and careful and invisible to survive it, one creature had looked at a young woman from Cork with a dead priest's letter in her bag, and known, without deliberation, without calculation, without being asked, that she was worth sitting beside. And had done so, and had kept doing so, until being beside her was no longer something that needed to be done because she had found, in that quiet house on the moor, in the rooms she no longer had to manage, in the life she had stopped expecting to be temporary, the thing she had not known she was looking for. Which was simply this: a place that knew her, a place that did not require her to be anything other than exactly what she was. The bulbs would come up in spring, they always came up in spring. She put the kettle on.